talk a little bit about welcome. This is the scenes from a live stream. We got 113 subscribers now. Look out. I've gained 13 subscribers, I think, in the last 2 months. But they're all real. I get all my subscribers the fucking hard way. Well, maybe not the really hard way, but most of my subscribers are IRL people. I don't know what the fuck people think of my videos. I don't even think anybody watches them. My last videos I worked really hard on. They're like 2 hours long each, and they got like 10 views each. So, uh, but the content is there, you know. For part of what I'm trying to do, I don't know what to fucking talk about. Now that there's people actually listening, this has always been sort of like a private diary for me, and a private sort of like experiment. I guess I could keep it. This is my auto fiction, maybe. Even though it's not necessarily about style. The point of doing it live, I think you can just cover a lot more ground, and you can be, I don't know, more. To me, better things happen with spontaneity. I think even with revision, you're trying to like maintain the sort of like explosions of discovery that occur in spontaneity, and like the emotions that are sort of like released with those discoveries. And I think the purpose of art, or at least one of the purposes of art, is to sort of like deliver those kind of energetic bursts or little nodules or whatever to the receiver. And, you know, I don't know, I guess if one of the only things I know is that what I'm feeling is what you're feeling. And so if you, whatever you feel when you're making something, I think is embedded in it. And so, for me, that's generally what the work is about. I get high and I try to have epiphany orgasms. Or, I don't know, epiphanies are sort of like these mental, I'm trying to think of another word for orgasm. Not climax. I don't know. I feel like I should talk about something other than fucking literature or something. Because is life bigger than that? I suppose it is. You know, I mean, the world outside of the media and the arts, we spend so much time thinking about, I mean, the TRUMP announced his candidacy last night. Not that anybody gives a fuck. I did want to talk about the philosophy of modern songbook, even though I haven't fucking read it. God, this is embarrassing how I'm just jumping all over the place. I normally don't have this problem. It's just now that people are listening, I feel like I have to talk about something that matters or something. Or talk about something that's like accessible or like. But I read this review of Philosophy of Modern Song today where it was taking Bob Dylan to task for sort of his misogyny, which I guess is rampant in the book. I haven't read it. I've read little excerpts of this and that, and definitely it seems like he's Old Testament. I mean, I think that's really one of the foremost things about Bob is like his work is kind of rooted in the Bible. In addition to sort of like folk music, you know, that kind of tradition, that kind of like canon. But the Old Testament in particular, I mean, he's Jewish. Like, in his book, he argues like on behalf of like polygamy and shit like that. Like, I guess I'm not surprised. It's surprising how far he takes that stuff in his book. I feel like he was doing it sort of as a provocative sort of reaction to like the kind of eggshell snowflake culture. Like Bob is kind of half and half in a certain way. I mean, apparently there's parts of this book where he like says positive things about George Bush in the first Iraq war, which I find obviously insane. But that's kind of Bob likes to troll, and he's a rural dude from Minnesota. Like, I don't know, he's probably a fucking half. He's sympathetic to the farmers and shit like that. He's a small town guy in a lot of ways, or a country guy. He's in touch with that. I would say that that's one of the things that gives his music. I mean, a lot of his music is driven by trying to antagonize people or send out like bile or venom at people. You got a lot of nerve to say you are my friend and this kind of shit. A lot of his songs are kind of like revenge songs, or and his music, I mean, certainly there are women that love Bob Dylan, obviously, but like there's also like a lot of women. Like I heard Elaine Kahn say something about how she hates Bob Dylan. Maybe it's a huge red flag. I mean, are Bob Dylan songs saturated with toxic attitude towards women? Uh, there's sort of a Madonna horror thing going on, maybe. Shelter from the Storm. She breaks just like a little girl. Uh, he puts him on a pedestal. I mean, that was boomer. That's probably a hallmark of boomer shit. Is there's a lot of that's when the patriarchy just sort of, I don't know. At least the artistic patriarchy got to really have their cake and eat it too. Not to be. All right. Um, I wrote a new book this week. I'm probably gonna put a different cover on it, but I don't know. I'm so lazy. I don't want to draw another cover, so I just used a drawing I already made. Plus, I don't know. The book covers August, September, October, and early November. And it's all about cringe. Gen Z loves cringe. I think with streaming, you're gonna have you can't edit anything out, obviously. So anyway, this is my new book. Like I said, I'll probably put a different cover. I wanted to call it Shenmue, but this is a lot of stuff that I've read already at open mics, from my notebooks, using the open mic as sort of like, I don't know, not necessarily a revision process so much as like maybe a developmental process or a familiarity process, like cultivation process. Like I have these sort of raw pieces in I get sick of reading stuff. I don't, there was a long time where I really wasn't reading anything more than once. But now I really don't like to read the same thing necessarily more than once every couple weeks. Depending on what open mic I'm at. Like, if it's some open mic where like the pressure's really on and I gotta wow everybody, I want to go in with something really strong, and so I'll, be a little bit. Maybe I'll read something that but like this stuff is like, I don't know. It's a lot of stuff that I've read at fucking in Long Island City, at fucking Shades of Grain. Stuff I've read. I read this one piece in the reading I did in Paris, France on Zoom. There's a lot of sexual material in it. I guess because my sex life. Maybe I should talk about my sex life. That's one of the central crossroads, I would say, of all of the issues of the day is sex. And maybe this is all of society, maybe it's just me, but the past few months, things have sort of like, reopened for business or whatever, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, like, part of what I'm going through now is like I'm really kicking myself because I've lived in this apartment for almost 2 years. And the first year and a half, I basically I was alone the whole time. I was spending all my time alone. I wasn't really performing, at least not that much in bars. This is a running theme, I guess, in my vlogs. But so now it's like with these precious few months, whatever remaining, I'm trying to like get the most out of it as I possibly can. And in a certain way, it's already too late because I'm running out of money, and I don't know. Now that when I did these live streams and I pre-recorded them, it was a little bit easier to be totally transparent. Now I'm like worried that like if I put my whole fucking life on the internet, people are just gonna know everything I'm thinking and use it against me. But maybe that's my radical. Jesus Christ, are they building a fucking house right there? What are they doing? Oh no, they're doing like a gut renovation over there. Breaks your heart. Manifesting works. Keep manifesting. Onward and upward. But I don't give a fuck. I'm living it to the bone. I'm a radical. I'm a revolutionary. For honesty and goodness. Alright, cool. I'm going to this dinner party on Saturday. I gotta work tonight, filming this Reading It Poetry project. Tomorrow, I think I gotta go do this open mic at Music Inn. This guy Carlos messaged me. He makes these amazing videos. I see, this is what I should have been doing the whole time. I should have been running around with comedians doing fucking hosting open mic. I really only reopened my life socially in like March or so. And so it's taken about 6 months to get back up to speed. And I gotta say, I mean, the open mic is a great way to like organize all these people, get like kind of a community together, and make a lot of friends all at once. Like people are really looking for that. I think a lot of our fucking society is designed to keep people in their kind of like alienated isolation. Even eating in restaurants and stuff, it's like you got to pay to occupy public space. There's no shared public space. New York is better than that than some places. There's parks and things, but like generally any public space, any third place you go to, you have to spend money, or it's just corporatized like a Starbucks or a Chipotle, or so to actually create a third place where people can gather, where artists of all different disciplines, that's what Bohemia is, that's what the scene is, that's what needs to be happening in order to create a movement or an aesthetic, or in a certain way. I do think the culture is so bland, at least like the mainstream culture. It's weird because with the internet we're offered like kind of this infinity of subcultures. I mean, every little account is sort of its own subculture. But not very many of those subcultures can really get. I mean, you get a few thousand followers or something, I suppose, but as far as like having mass media cachet or platform, a lot of that stuff is very bland and kind of corporate and feels like force-fed. Even though people are very strongly have strong allegiances to things like Miley Cyrus or Taylor Swift or any of the Disney shit or the Marvel shit or whatever the fuck it is, the main culture is this kind of humongous, homogenized, bland, but it's also just, it's, the counterculture, the DIY culture, the zine culture, the house show culture, that still exists. It's on the internet, but you don't really see it feeding into the culture at large quite so much, really. At least it doesn't seem that way. I mean, things like the fucking Kardashians, Kendall Jenner, Harry Styles, these things feel, the counterculture became corporatized through the 70s, 80s, 90s, to the point that by the 90s nobody could really recognize, nobody even gave a fuck about like authenticity or anything. It's like people just love NSYNC, they love Backstreet Boys, they love these kind of corporate engineered music shit. And that's not to say there aren't like alternatives. That's a genre in and of itself, whatever the fuck it may be. The Mountain Goats or Silver Jews or fucking, is Jenny Lewis alt? I mean, Jenny Lewis was on some fucking Nickelodeon show or something, wasn't she? She was like a fucking child star. Like, I'm not necessarily saying that that precludes you from being authentic or even like super talented or something, but there's just so much product, and like it feels like the rest of us are just left to fend for ourselves, right? Like Miley Cyrus or Taylor Swift or whatever is like this huge conglomerate, Shell Oil or something. It's like you kind of have to buy from them. It's a monopoly. And yet the rest of us who are artists or musicians or whatever, conducting these kind of entrepreneurships through social media, trying to go on tour, trying to sell merch. You know, some people are able to kind of like make a living or something doing that. But it's like they don't really have a place. It doesn't feel like in like the traditional distribution channels. Like, or I don't know, maybe that's just because I feel the traditional distribution channels just feel like big inflated. It feels like the Macy's parade or something. It's like Spider-Man, X-Man, fucking, you know, it's all these big branded characters and shit. Fictional universes. I've been watching a lot of wrestling. Maybe I should talk exclusively about wrestling. Have I talked about wrestling? First of all, I got to recommend Jim Cornette podcast because it is the best thing on the internet. I mean, Jim Cornette is the funniest motherfucker on the internet, I think, hands down. If you ask me. I mean, maybe it's just his kind of old-fashioned down-home style appeals to me. But Cornette, I think I'm watching a lot of wrestling because I feel like anger or something. Helplessness. But also, like, you just have to go. I mean, this is something Dana Carvey said on, I just listened to the SNL podcast with Al Franken. Dana Carvey said, show business is an emotionally violent sport. That's one way of putting it. I mean, I think if you're going to be on stage and you're going to go for the brass ring or whatever and really make yourself public, and especially if you're going to involve yourself with a lot of people. I mean, this is kind of right what I did with the Slooge. Just like invite all these people in and be encouraging and like invite them into my home. Try and spark whatever they're doing, try and support their projects, give them a place on stage, create this sort of like, you know, scene, subculture, art community. You know, that's not to say, I'm not saying that I'm like taking credit for it or anything like that. I'm just saying that like, if you have a hub and if you have somebody who like can connect everybody socially, it's like that's how that shit can kind of get started or whatever. It's a petri dish. But at the same time, I am like a huge egomaniac and a super narcissist. And so like, you know, a recurring problem I have is like I flatter people until they like into joining like the cult of like, hey, we like each other as artists and aren't we great, and hey, I'm gonna put you on stage and like, hey, why don't you, that's not why I do it, but like when people don't like my poetry, generally I turn against them. Let's just put it I mean, to put it in blunt terms, I guess. And or even like, it doesn't even have to go that far. It's just like if people aren't as like boosting me as I am of them. Or, something that has happened recently a few times with women in particular is like they're more successful than I am. They come over because they saw me perform or something and they were impressed. One thing leads to another, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. And then, the next time they come over, I sort of have this like man therapy wine session where I complain about how everybody hates me and I'm a failure and New York poetry, like, I'm like the bad seed or whatever. And I'm like, I don't know, a notoriously awful person and poet and like an embarrassing human being to some people. I don't know. That's how I feel. And this like really turns the women off. And then they run, fleeing, and they never talk to me again. And that's on them, I feel like, because it feels like the experience is different between myself and them. Particularly during the Trump years. It was hard trying to enter the fray of like the New York art world or whatever, literary world, when Donald Trump had just gotten president. Especially when you're writing fucking poetry about face fucking and shit like that. I wasn't doing that at the time. But, now that I've fallen in with this group of sort of ne'er-do-wells and outsiders, real outsiders, people who do open mics, but people who have a lot of intelligence and integrity and aesthetic and power and genius, but they aren't necessarily playing by the rules, and they are kind of making their own thing. They didn't necessarily go through the traditional avenues to enter, or they don't have huge social media followings or whatever. I mean, that's the other thing that can get you cachet, is like if you have 3,000 followers, people will take you seriously as a writer, whether the fuck or not you're good at it. I mean, am I too obsessed with like the writing world? And this is something I've been thinking about. It's like, what the fuck, what is it about literature? What the fuck even is literature? It's like, what's different about it than comedy or music or movies or farming or being a veterinarian or, like, why am I not interested in fucking science or working on cars or, like my friend had this line in her poem about all poets are like reformed nerds or something. And I was like, I'm not a nerd. What am I a reformed nerd of? Like, I was never like, what was I a nerd about? I was never like, I never played Magic cards. I had some briefly. I played chess. Is that nerdy? I suppose it is. I mean, to be honest, I'm like a show business nerd. That's what I realized. Like, my life is about show business. I love show business. It's all I love. Not even necessarily fame so much as just like putting on a show, filming shit, making a TV show, going on stage. Like, is this about getting attention? I suppose it is. Attention your parents didn't give you or whatever. I suppose it is. But that's boring. It's just fun. I don't know. It's a place where like you get to pretend, you get to use your imagination, you get to be larger than life, you get to act. I mean, wrestling is one of these things. How many people Vince McMahon might be he's definitely one of my favorite actors. How many people have supplied us with the memes? Just from his facial expressions alone, like, McMahon is iconic, and he can go to 11 in a way that most actors can't. Because he's in wrestling, and he's in an arena with 20,000 fucking people. I mean, Nicolas Cage is not even doing that. Dennis Hopper is not doing that. Like, in a certain way, wrestling is theater in a way that film acting is not. Like, film is like a dream. Wrestling is like very real. It is the closest thing we have to like what the Greeks did in fucking big amphitheaters and shit. It is the same fucking thing. And McMahon, in the saga of his whole family, to be honest, he is one of the theater geniuses of the fucking world. And certainly of this country. I mean, the WWE is one of the premier theater companies in the fucking world. Like, and I enjoy it. Going to those extremes as a human being. McMahon has this promo where he's like, I love life, you know, and it's like, yeah, we see that, dude. Like, he's cheating on his wife, he's banging he's fucking writing himself into. When McMahon started wrestling at like whatever he was, 50 years old, I couldn't believe it. I was like, first of all, it's hilarious that this dude is as jacked as he is. Because you never really knew that. He was always like this nerdy kind of announcer guy during Hogan era and like the early 90s. And he was kind of lame, to be honest. You didn't really know he had this whole fucking jacked up physique. He wanted to be one of the wrestlers the whole fucking time. And to be honest, I think when all is said and done, I think McMahon is the most memorable character, actually. I think he was, to be honest, I think he took it further than anybody else. Just like, well, for one thing, he's the iconic villain. He is the CEO. He is the corporation. He is the Trump-esque kind of like figure. He's the patriarch. He's the boss. He's the evil boss. It's amazing that WWE was tapped into that and would satirize that. This sort of corporate enemy, really. Which WWE was, actually. I mean, he was playing in, and like that is his brilliance, and what he took further, I think, was playing into what the public perception of what was happening, using what was real. The truth makes the best angle. I forget who said that, but maybe it was McMahon. The truth makes the best angle. Meaning, if Lita is cheating on Matt Hardy with Edge, we'll just write that into the fucking show. Because I'm sure the wrestlers will have no problem, like, you know, revealing their personal lives in front of 20,000 people and, like, making it a part of the fucking storyline. Like, that seems like a totally reasonable thing for your boss to ask you to do. Like, it's amazing that they got away with what they got away with. Mick Foley going off a fucking cage. Like, how the fuck did they, like, how is that legal? Like, a lot of this shit they did was like, this probably should be illegal. Like, Owen Hart died, right? Plummeting from the rafters. A lot of the wrestlers die before the age of 50. But as a form of show business, it kind of it's something that you can look at and learn from without necessarily wanting to participate. Although watching all this wrestling, I'm like super wanting to do it again. I really want to get back in the ring. I do think as an artistic form, it's actually just very interesting and entertaining. I think it's unfortunate that most of the promotions are so bad, particularly, like, I guess over the last 15 years, like, a lot of wrestling has just been, like, terrible. Apparently it's, like, unwatchable now. The Roman Reigns era has not been great. The fact that John Cena is, like, an elder now and, like, a legend is, like, kind of nuts. I stopped watching right around the time he came in. I just thought, this is not for me. He was like an Iraq war soldier. That's what that was about. He was like sort of a hood white guy. He freestyle rapped and shit. But he was like probably their ideal, guy that would go to fucking Afghanistan. Which the WWE did on Christmas. A nice present to the wrestlers. That's their time off. They get to fly to Iraq and put on a show in the middle of the desert. Vince McMahon is a huge Republican. He donates a lot of money. He was a huge Trump. Linda McMahon was in the administration. She was like the fucking secretary of like small business or something. Like Linda McMahon had a goddamn cabinet post. That's the funniest fucking angle of all. Senator McMahon, Senator Linda McMahon. Why didn't Vince run? Vince should fucking run. This country's so fucked. I'd rather vote for Vince McMahon than Trump. I don't think Vince McMahon is like a genocidal, like racist like Trump is. Like, I think I think McMahon is racist in his own way, but like, I don't think if he became president, he would like actively start killing the weak people or something. Like, Trump would torture people. Would McMahon do that? I don't know. What would a McMahon presidency look like? I don't know. No, obviously no health insurance. Probably he'd work you to death. Fitness would be prioritized. Steroids would be mandatory. But they'd have great branding. They'd have great pyro. They'd have incredible... The speeches would be off the chain. The promos. The State of the Union. Who the fuck? Putin? He'd probably love Putin. Who would he be? Who would he be trying to start a war with? He'd probably go for Kim Jong-un, I guess, immediately. Xi! Kiss my ass! Afghanistan! You're fired. Trump did kind of rip the "you're fired" thing off Vince, didn't he? That's one reason, I guess, why I didn't go near wrestling for the last 4 years, because Trump was so tied to wrestling. But I think, ECW was a good example of, like, kind of a hipster artisanal wrestling. Like, if you actually did wrestling, like, in a highbrow way, or, like, there's a lot that you could do with wrestling. Like, just a lot of the gimmicks, a lot of the booking is, as a form, I think, here's something DiBiase was saying, is like, wrestlers are the best improvisers, actually, in the world. He was saying, when he was working with Stallone on Paradise Alley, which was the movie that came after Rocky, he was saying Stallone, some of the extras or something were making fun of the wrestlers, because this was like the late 70s, and Stallone like stopped and he was like, I don't want to hear another fucking word, because these guys are the best improvisational actors in the world. Like, they're in character the whole fucking time. That's the thing about wrestling, is it is acting. It isn't just wrestling. You're wrestling in character. Are you hearing that buzz? That sucks. And they have and wrestling is an improvisation, even, in a way that most theater is not. Most theater, right, you have lines, everything is super rehearsed. you know, for the most part, the wrestling matches, they might have rehearsed, like, spots that they do, or, like, the finish, obviously, usually rehearsed. Although, when we did BBW at Queens College, that was completely improvised. We had no fucking idea at all what we were going to do. Literally. We didn't even know who was going to win. Like, the idea was it was going to be like a three-way match. Whoever won was going to be, like, crowned champion. But nobody had the belt. Maybe we decided beforehand that I was going to win. I'm not exactly sure about that. But we didn't rehearse anything. We literally didn't talk about any of it. And yet, that match, if I may say so myself, that was a 5-star Dave Meltzer match. That was a match of the year candidate, definitely. Like, Eric went off the ladder. The in-ring psychology of that match, and the storytelling that we did. If you haven't watched the Brooklyn Backyard Wrestling videos, I encourage you to, because they're interesting. The Queens College match is actually an excellent, excellent wrestling match. The match that I did with Eric in the backyard was not so great, because I didn't do any goddamn moves. There really weren't even very many moves that happened. It was kind of a brawl. It was like, it was raining, and there were it was more of like a street fight. I hit him with the Jesus thing. And I did some, like, weapon stuff, but I didn't really, like, I didn't do a single move. I didn't do a suplex or anything like that, even though I could have. At the time, it was, the idea was I was Trump, and by beating the shit out of Trump, it was going to, like, cause him to lose the election. Which is not what happened. Obviously. During the Queens College match, I kind of lost most of the Trump thing. I stopped doing the Trump thing, because that was after the Grab the Pussy tape came out, and, like, it kind of became less funny as we got closer to the election, obviously. And so I was more of a face. The audience was actually really liking me at that show, surprisingly. Whereas at the backyard, the Bash at the Slooge, they hated me. This is my shoot interview about Brooklyn Backyard Wrestling. Frankly Fabulous, full shoot interview. The truth about Brooklyn Backyard Wrestling. Well, the truth was there was just shitloads of drama, and, like, I wanted to lose to show that Trump was weak, you know what I mean? Or I think I won the match, but I got beat up afterwards. I think that's, you know, because Trump was just such a classic heel. He was so easy to hate, and, like, it just felt like a natural fit for the Frankly Fabulous character, satire. We didn't understand that Trump was more powerful than satire, even though wrestling was honestly probably the best way you could lampoon the guy, because it's so ridiculous, and you actually get to see him get his ass kicked. But now I realize my angle should have been all about how threatening because what Trump said about what he says about immigration is that they're all in MS-13 and shit, which is not true. If you know, illegal immigrants, which I do, they're very nice. Not to generalize, but, like, I haven't met too many people in fucking MS-13 personally. And so that should have been the angle, is I should have just been saying, like, the USSA is an MS-13. Which obviously he's not. He's obviously, like, a fair fighter and, like, an enthusiastic. He's probably a citizen, even. That should have been the thing. I was born here, motherfucker. He's an anchor baby. See, with wrestling, it's like we had a lot of crazy ideas for storylines that actually really would have been funny if we would have kept doing it. We had a whole thing where Frankly Fabulous was going to be transgender. Because my finishing move, I came up with my finishing move in, like, the 8th grade or whatever, 1998. and I called it, just so happened I called it the Gender Bender. And what it was, it's an atomic drop into like a diamond cutter. So you drop them like on their nutsack, and then you diamond cut them. So that's the Gender Bender. You spin into the diamond cutter. I invented that move. The first, the last, the greatest, frankly fabulous, inventor of the Gender Bender. But, the weather got bad. It's hard to do backyard wrestling in the wintertime. You kind of have to pack it up. But I don't know. It probably would have been smart to continue to do it. I'm ready to get back in the wrestling game. I want to start a federation in Central Park. Just throw a mattress down in like the Great Lawn. Start wrestling. What the fuck? They're not going to stop us. But wrestling is a metaphor kind of for like getting your ass kicked in the emotional violence of show business. And well, it's also just a way of thinking about show business. It's like what Paul Heyman did, where he fuses all of these different lexicons and styles. He takes a Yoshihiro Tajiri and a Super Crazy. He takes a luchador and more of kind of a shoot style Japanese wrestler who does a lot of kicks and things, and in addition to aerial stuff. But Super Crazy was like a luchador, high flyer, a lot of Hurricane Ranas. But like they were also innovative. They took it out of the ring. They'd do table spots. They went way out into the crowd. Those matches were really exciting at the top of the show. I mean, somebody said something about nobody got more out of less, and Super Crazy and Yoshihiro Tajiri were huge talents. Everybody, I don't think that's really fair to say he got more out of less, because everybody in ECW was super talented. He just had an eye for talent. And like a lot of guys that were overlooked, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, Benoit, Steve Austin, a lot of guys would sort of went through the major promotions. They never really got a gimmick that caught on, and they just sort of got flushed out. Paul Heyman found them, like Steve Austin or Mick Foley. All those guys had been through WCW, and like it just really, they couldn't find a gimmick that worked, or they weren't really right for that era, coming out of Hogan era. They went to ECW. These were talented guys, but they weren't famous. They weren't over with the crowd. Maybe I'll move into the other room. It's just so loud. They weren't over with the crowd. Paul Heyman found his thing in Philadelphia where he could do it for no money. It really was art wrestling. It was like starting a fucking art gallery in a bad neighborhood or something and putting all the fucking good artists that you love in it, but who aren't famous yet or anything. And he gave them gimmicks that worked. He found real storylines. He made it exciting. And then the WCW snapped all those guys up. They needed that kind of like development period, or he was able to develop a new style and a new tone for wrestling because he was doing it in sort of this low budget off. He was in Philadelphia, so he's on the East Coast. He's near the major markets. But like, he's not in New York. He's not trying to bite off more he can chew. He can sort of, they have their own arena, for Christ's sake. I do think that was important, that they had kind of a home base. God damn it. Like with the fucking open mic, I think you see that. And with like the Sludge or the Portal at the Spa, you see that. It's like if you have a home base, it's a gathering place. People know to show up. There's a home feel to it, right? There's a heart. There's a location. There's a face. you know, the ECW arena had kind of iconic identity. Uh, and like I think that's important when you're like when you're trying to create a unity to a thing, to a scene, to a movement. I mean, ECW really was that. Everything in wrestling in the early 90s was kind of old fashioned. It was still about these big cartoonish kind of superhero gimmicks. Paul Heyman brought in the sort of grunge 90s Howard Stern, you know, Too Hot for TV, Jerry Springer vibe, but also the wrestling. He brought in guys from Japan. He brought in the great Sasuke or Hayabusa or, you know, those Masato Tanaka, uh, Mike Awesome matches. You could tell he was getting tapes. You could tell he was like a wrestling aficionado, and he was sort of an underground. He was trading tapes, and he was keeping an eye. He was scouting shit from all over the world. You know, I don't know that fucking Vince McMahon even he probably didn't give a fuck. You know, about any of that stuff very much. You know, did he give a fuck about the FMW death matches or anything like that? I mean, you can tell that's sort of where, uh, you know, a lot of that Sabu, Terry Funk, Cactus Jack energy in ECW came from. Like those barbed wire matches and shit. Like that was shit. I mean, they've probably been doing that in the States forever. And even Paul Heyman was in WCW. He's an example of a guy who was in that system. He wasn't really able to make a mark because, like, I mean, he had his phone and shit, and his. Cornette tells this great story about Paul Heyman, but he had to start his own thing to show everybody, hey, this works. Your shit is stale. This is where it's at. You know, they wouldn't give him carte blanche to do the booking in WCW. They would never go for that. So he created his own thing. It was East Coast. It was gnarly. It was rated X. It was extreme. It was blood. It was, but the wrestling. He combines all of these different styles. He has hardcore guys, tag team guys, Axel Rotten Balls Mahoney, or the FBI guys. You know, that gimmick. It's those guys have their one little part of the show. They come in, they're fucking awesome. They have a great match. The ring looks great, that deep blue color. It slams really well. All this shit matters. The logos, their camera angles were always really interesting. They were always doing really interesting venues like the Madhouse at the Extreme in Queens, or they do the Manhattan Center. Like, they do smaller venues, but their angles were always different. WWF television always kind of looked the same. It's always in some big ass arena or whatever. They'd always kind of do the same angle. They wouldn't really do like a diamond ring angle or anything like that. And so this is all stuff that, because I'm watching wrestling or thinking about wrestling or hearing the stories about what goes on backstage and how people's egos get hurt or this or that, it's giving me like a lens through which to sort of think about. I mean, I'm basically a promoter. I'm basically doing what Vince McMahon does. I'm putting on a show. So I've got a venue. I need to get people to come out. I need talent. I'm thinking about the roster. I'm thinking about the card. You know, what do we put on when? The different, and like I was saying with the Paul Heyman stuff, it's like the different styles, right? You have stand-up comedians, you have musicians, you have a lot of different styles of music. You have, like I had this guy the other week, he plays saxophone, he's got a laptop. And then I have guitar players. I have poets, I have fiction people, I have, um, I have performance artists. I have, you know, kind of wild card eccentric. So it's like making it a great show. the variety. You know, if I was just doing a poetry open mic, I don't think that would be exciting for me. I mean, like these guys who like kind of got shut out at the major promotions or whatever, they kind of had to go to do their own thing, but they also, there was a freedom with that. Being on the indie circuit, maybe you're not in front of as large of an audience, but like you can do your own ideas, you can do your own things. And then you can show people maybe something truer to who you actually are, you know. So like, you know, for me going out into comedy world and bringing in musicians, bringing in just the kind of like character, the village character type kind of performers, like that stuff that has like, I think aesthetically it adds up to a more interesting show. At least, you know, I do want to bring in a broader audience for poetry. And I think the poets, like my friend was saying, her teacher said her poem sounded like a stand up comedy routine. And maybe, I don't know how she feels about that, but I don't think that's a bad thing at all. In fact, you know, why not get poets in comedy clubs and like, I know that sounds terrible, or like, you know, if they both kind of came halfway, if the comedians wrote a little bit more precise or something, I don't know, thought a little bit more creatively like the poets, if the poets performed a little bit more openly, if they loosened up a little bit, you know, like the comedians. In any case, it's like having a lot of different style of wrestling. You have, you know, the Taz and Sabu match where you have Sabu's kind of aerial style. You have fucking Taz suplexing the motherfucker all over the place through tables and shit. You know, Sabu was really the innovator of the table, I feel like. The table is this kind of surrealistic, the way it's kind of recontextualized. It's just kind of this object of destruction. They said that if Sabu didn't break a table during a match, he would just get a table out and start to jump through it after the match. He'd start to do flips through it until it broke. So he clearly had this vision of what the table could be and what it meant. And to me, I gotta say, table spots were like my favorite fucking part of wrestling. I gotta say. Like, I know that like that's not like Jim Cornette calls it furniture. He doesn't like the gymnastics, you know, through all the furniture. Tables, ladders, and chairs, that's all furniture. And all the aerial shit is like gymnastics to him. I think he's got a point. To me, like the aerial stuff, it's exciting to watch, but like it I could never do like a 450 splash or like a shooting star press. And to me, it's like dubious how much those moves would actually hurt. I'm glad they exist, and I'm glad like the aerial guys exist, but I know like a lot of kids would get into wrestling because they love like the aerial shit, like Rey Mysterio and shit. And Rey Mysterio is awesome as hell. And I love aerial wrestling. Don't get me wrong. I fucking love it. But like, I also think that like if that's all the guy does, that's not that interesting either. I kind of like the people that like Shawn Michaels can kind of do both. You know, he can do a moonsault. He can do his elbow drop thing. Maybe he'll do like a, you know, fucking plancha or whatever the fuck it is. Or like, you know, Lance Storm, I always liked his aerial game. Because he'd like do these kind of like spinning heel kicks off the top turnbuckle. But he was like, he had an interesting blend of styles. He could do DDTs and a lot of different kind of suplexes and shit. So he could do like, you know, I don't know, scientific, but he also could do a lot of scientific holds. He trains in the dungeon, right? With Stu Hart. So he did like a half crab. He'd do a lot of different submission stuff. So he was like a scientific wrestler, but he could also do a lot of different kicks. He'd do a moonsault maybe sometimes, or like a plancha, but he wasn't doing like a fucking 450 splash, you know? He wasn't doing like whatever the fuck those like I think he did like a cartwheel elbow thing, which was cool, but I don't think he really did like a, you know, whatever the great Sasuke does, where he does a cartwheel and then just like fucking backflip flies like over the top rope to the outside. Like that shit. Like those guys are amazing, but I could never do that stuff. That Van Damme was one of my all-time favorites. Rob Van Dam, he was one of the greats. Um, uh, but yeah, Cornette's podcast. I've been watching this other thing. It's Smoky Mountain Wrestling. These on Cornette's podcast, they were saying that ECW didn't hold up that well, but Smoky Mountain really held up really well. So I was like, okay, all the episodes are on YouTube, like the full episodes. And I always remember hearing about it as a kid when we were driving to Florida. I was reading this wrestling almanac from like '98 or whatever, reading about Smoky Mountain Wrestling and shit. Jim Cornette, because Lance Storm and Chris Jericho started out kind of there in a way. They were the thrill seekers. So you could tell Heyman was paying attention to that stuff too, because he picked up Jericho and he'd pick up people from Smoky Mountain Wrestling or whatever. But I never saw it ever. That's one of the things that was kind of tantalizing about wrestling in the '90s is you heard about all this stuff, but you couldn't necessarily find it. You could watch WWF, WCW, but it was very hard to find stuff from Japan. You'd find little clips and shit online, you know, in the early internet. You'd find like a 20-second clip or something, or a 10-second clip of like a move. But like you couldn't really get on YouTube and watch every fucking match from Japan ever or something, you know, like you can now. So you'd read about this stuff and it'd be like, whoa, what was Smoky Mountain Wrestling like? So it was legendary, you know? And so I was watching. The thing about Cornette is he is like old school till he fucking dies. That's kind of his gimmick. Is that he's like he learned how to do it in the '70s in the South, and like that's what he thinks wrestling is. It's like if you're a heel, you got to do it this way, and like the audience needs to hate you. I guess people attack the heels. This guy was saying that somebody came after him with a barber straight razor after the match and slashed his bicep with the barber straight razor because they hated him so much. Like the old style wrestling where it's just like a guy doing holds. It's more like collegiate wrestling or something where it's like they'll kind of just do, you know, it's more about, they do an arm bar into a hammer lock or whatever, you know, like then he turned it into a fucking half Nelson or whatever, you know, like I'm into that stuff too, but like as a kid especially, it was not that exciting to watch two like sort of fat guys. Like the body types also changed a lot. You know, wrestlers used to be just these kind of like hairy, like like Bruno Sammartino or whatever, just like these hairy, thick Luthez. It wasn't really until the '80s and '90s that they became super jacked, super chiseled. McMahon really did that. He really like changed the body type to make it super definition, you know, more like bodybuilders, more like a modern, like a post-Arnold, I guess, kind of body. I mean, that's probably the aspect of wrestling that I'm like least interested in, just being, you know, like as a kid, I always knew that like I probably wasn't going to be able to become a professional wrestler. Which was kind of hard to take when I was, you know, in 7th grade. You know? I remember my cousin Patrick talking about how he wanted to go to the power plant when he grew up and become a professional wrestler. And hey, so did I, basically. You know, there was a brief moment where I was like wanted to go to Japan to be a professional wrestler like Chris Benoit. You know, in like 2000 or whatever. And but it's like I'm just clearly not a big enough person, you know. I'm not really believable. In BBW, in backyard wrestling, I was pretty believable. My body actually looks somewhat like I'm pretty strong. I'm stronger than you'd think. But like Kevin Nash is like 6'10", and he and he's jacked. You know, he weighs like I don't even know how much that dude weighs, like probably 400 pounds or something. You know, Hulk Hogan is like 6'8" or something, which is kind of insane. Even the small guys in wrestling, like fucking Shawn Michaels is like 6 feet tall. I think Bret Hart's like at least 5'10". It's like those are the small guys. Benoit, I think, was like 5'8" or something. But he was also willing to do shit that, like, obviously he paid a price, you know. I was never gonna fucking do that. I was never, you know, like, I'm like Flair. Flair has the same fucking match with every single person. All he does is chops, and then he does the turnbuckle thing. He does that suplex where he like holds the guy in the air for a long time. In the figure four. That's about it for Flair. I think maybe he has like a knee thing that he does, and like I think maybe he comes off the turnbuckle with like a forearm smash or something. But he's able to wrestle 60-minute fucking matches. I mean, does Flair take a power bomb? Apparently, the WWF ring is very hard, or it was. They fucking Cornette likened it to a parking lot or a frying pan. In the 80s, apparently the fucking mat is like a frying pan, which is like, Jesus Christ, seriously? You know, getting you know, power slammed or whatever onto a parking lot doesn't sound like a whole hell of a lot of fun. I mean, wrestlers are really, I think they have to be kind of masochistic or something. It's like, they're on the road. I mean, I watched this documentary. The guy was saying they're on the road 350 days a year or something. I find that hard to believe. Shawn Michaels said he was on the road 279 days one year or something. That sounds about right. But, like, Jesus Christ, man, like, listening to their schedule, it just, like, it doesn't sound doable. Like, they're driving to the next town after the goddamn show and stuff. I mean, it's one thing to, like, play gigs. It's another thing to, like, fly off tables and shit. Pretend to beat each other up. But in a certain way, it's also a metaphor. It's showmanship. The WWF has a lot of that. And so showmanship, I think, is a big part of my life. It's a big part of who I am. And poetry is not necessarily always the best fucking place for that. I mean, although I suppose I could do whatever I want. If people like it, they like it. But, you know, it's also about putting poetry in the continuum of show business. Because I do think poetry, I mean, maybe not real poetry. Maybe I just don't like actual poetry anymore. Like, I think to some degree. Well, I was talking about this the other day. It's just like, in the early part of the reason I went to poetry because I was like lonely and sad. And it's something to do with your solitude. It's a form of writing that's actually like you can kind of just do what you're doing and be alone and enjoy yourself. At least that's the conclusion I ultimately came to. Whereas like when you're alone and you're writing fiction or something, it feels like work. It doesn't feel like you're being alone with yourself necessarily. It feels like you're going into this kind of imaginary other world. So it's also another kind of like busyness. Whereas like poetry, you can kind of relax and I don't know. It's like it's more contemplative. It's more like ruminative. The size of the poem on the page oftentimes will add up to way, way, way more time than you would expect from how long you might think it takes to read it. You might spend days and days and days thinking about some short little poem or something. Um, and I also think poetry is all stand-up comedy is really poetry. These words, these definitions are sort of like meaningless actually. They're just identifiers, and to be honest they are like partition. They're ways to like sell stuff or like to define things as like comedy. Boom, it goes in the comedy club. You know what you're getting laughs. I want to see stand-up comedy. That's what I'm going to go see. And it's going to be this like thing that is more popular because I don't know, it's maybe easier to understand or something. It's more accessible, whatever. um, music obviously has like instruments, tones, chords, melodies, keys, whatever. Poetry, on the other hand, is like, well, it's slam poetry maybe, or it's, like this grave, like serious, whoa. Like a lot of the comedians who come to the open mic, their reaction is, whoa, I didn't know there was going to be all this poetry. I better do something serious, or, are people going to laugh at me because they just saw this fucking poetry? And like, part of the point of doing it, I think, is to break down those kind of fears and apprehensions. The idea that there's like emotional turns on a dime. To me, that doesn't bother me at all. I mean, if an artist can transport you to a place, you'll go to that place with them. They have 5 minutes to do it. And then when it's over, you sort of come back to reality. I come up, blah, 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 bam. Then you go to another thing. It might be, now it's a comedian. It's like, okay, maybe a poet just read something super serious. I'm not trying to like juxtapose things that are like in bad taste or something, or like offensive necessarily, but like, it's like food, right? I think this is a principle just like in general, is like generally when like disparate, not always, but like, um, if you have the right ingredients, I suppose. Like a lot of times when you get a burrito bowl, they'll put the beans over here, and the chicken over here, and the lettuce here, and the tomatoes here, and the rice here. And it's like, it's only after you've mixed it all together. Like on a bite, you want a little bit of tomato, you want a little bit of lettuce, you want a little bit of meat, you want all that stuff. You want all, at least I do. Maybe that's just me. But to me, having the different flavors, having a soft tomato that's like acidic, tangy, having a bean that's like, a little bit more like a legume. Is it a legume? It's crumbly or something, almost, in a way. It's chewy or something. The lettuce is a little crunchy. The meat, of course, is just the thing that like is tasty and savory and kind of chewy. And then the rice is also kind of like a little bit of like a grainy. I want all of those different things on my tongue. and in my mouth, I want all of those different flavors. They're complementary flavors, right? As I do the open mic more, I get to know the performers more. And I don't know. I also think as an audience, you just have to be prepared for anything. And that's part of the fun. That's part of the open mic aspect. Because if somebody comes up and does something shitty, boom, 5 minutes, you're going to have something completely different. And so it's never that bad for that long, really. And even if you're doing it right, even stuff that's bad can be kind of entertaining, like the Gong Show or whatever. And so it's almost like fusion there with music. Things that you wouldn't think go together, like rap and country, you put them together, and then bam, you have Old Town Road. One of the masterpieces of the last 5 years or whatever. Like a lot of times when cultures blend, when foods blend, right? That's something we've experienced a lot, I think, in our lifetime. One of the prime artistic or something movements I feel like of my generation was like food fusion, food trucks, all these different world cuisines kind of being experimenting with flavors from everywhere. And just because food is from opposite sides of the world, now that we have a global village, the internet, airplanes, whatever, you can bring food from the other side of the fucking world combined. You know more about the other cultures. There's more kind of mixing with immigrants in this country or wherever, which when that blends, the food blends, and that stuff a lot of times creates, it's like biracial babies. They're the most beautiful, right? That open mic is like I'm sorry, I don't mean to make like a dumb metaphor, but the point being, it's almost like some kind of natural like truth or something that when you can combine. And so I think to some degree having these things partitioned, I would rather see a variety show actually. If I went to a concert, you're going to see 3 bands, that's cool. But like, why not throw a comedian or poet in between the bands? Why not throw some other stuff on there, like a wrestling card? A wrestling card might have 8 matches. It's got the heavyweight title match. It's got some tag team stuff. It has probably some women's matches. They used to have, it's probably got some high flying shit. It's probably, you try to touch all that stuff, right? And that's also probably something I try to do in my writing. It's just like the variety of going to as many different places as you can, throwing in as many different senses and thoughts and different parts of the brain, different parts of your perception, different parts of your experience, different parts of your consciousness, maybe things that go beyond consciousness. Maybe, that's why I'll put a lot of stuff in that's sort of language writing or, nonsense kind of like that. To be honest, that a lot of my favorite writing is like that. Even when I was a kid, some of the earliest stuff I was attracted to was like Lewis Carroll stuff, the Jabberwocky, which is a nonsense poem, actually. I don't think it's based in any kind of like actual language. And then, well, okay, here's something maybe I should talk about. My friend was asking me about language poetry, which is something, I don't know what the fuck they teach in schools, but the vibe that I get is that language poetry is not that popular anymore. It maybe was sort of academically, I don't know, reigning. I don't know. Maybe in the 80s, 90s, even into the 2000s, it probably was like one of the most, I don't know. it was kind of like the predominant, I would say, postmodern literary. It was sort of the reigning style, and at least that's how it seems. I'm not. Maybe that's just because in avant-garde shit anyway. There was a lot of language poetry, whereas I think particularly like the Trump moment, especially. I mean, is Trump a language poet? um, there was a, it's looked on, or it was looked on, I think, as kind of the ultimate privilege, that you could have time to write these texts that are just like gibberish, sort of nonsense writing. Or it's also like, is it a way of abdicating political responsibility? You're not really talking about anything. You're not. I mean, the language poets definitely wouldn't think so. They would say that what they were doing was incredibly political, which is true, but they were also white for the most part, and a lot of them were male and straight and this and that. And so I think it is sort of over. I mean, Charles Bernstein definitely is still out there doing it, but I think a lot of it is kind of. I don't see a lot of people my age that even like know what the fuck it is actually, or trying to write that way. There's a lot of people that like there's New York School kind of things, or Eileen Miles kind of influence, but like you don't see that many people that are just like writing like sound poetry or noise poetry. Okay, so this is kind of what I want to talk about with language poetry, is just like where it comes from, because I do think that those people don't really deserve credit. I think the people that like get credit for it didn't really, they just kind of stole it, which is often the case. That's not to say that they're not great. I mean, a lot of my, I hate to say it, but a lot of my favorite poets are language poets from the 70s and 80s. Charles Bernstein, Bruce Andrews, Ron Silliman, who else? I've looked at some of the other shit. It doesn't speak to me quite as much. I mean, I'm really into My Life. Is that Len Higinian, or that's, who wrote My Life? Uh, James Sherry. I like the New York language poets a lot. Some of the San Francisco language poets are a little too, I just I don't live there. They're a little too like misty, and like a little too, like, I have Ray Armitrout's selected, and I'm just not that into it, to be honest. It's okay. Um, but I would say, and I'm not encyclopedic about this by any stretch of the imagination, because I am an autodidact, but my sort of, layman's understanding. Okay, so I think you can really look at, like, first of all, John Ashbery's book, The Tennis Court Odes. But I mean, really, like, Gertrude Stein is language poetry. Tender Buttons is language poetry, really. Um, like, they didn't really do anything that Gertrude Stein didn't already do. To some degree. And maybe there's even fucking things. I'm sure there probably are. Is fucking Lewis Carroll language poetry? I mean, some of the Bible is fucking language poetry in a certain way. Meaning that it's just like, it kind of highlights the language as material. It's sort of abstract, or it is abstract in a lot of ways. It's maybe like a stream of consciousness, although I guess not necessarily. It's almost like dreamlike. I suppose it probably, Gertrude Stein fucking studied with, who was that psychologist guy at Johns Hopkins. He's like a famous guy. William something. Fuck, I can't remember. William James? I don't know. But if you read the fucking Tennis Court Oath, there's a lot of language poetry in it. And it's just, it's like there's sort of cut up type stuff. It's kind of gibberish. There's leaps and syntax. It's like the text is like surface. It kind of keeps you outside, even though it does kind of, well, not always, but like it does kind of like, uh, like you could read, maybe not a narrative, but like there are meanings to it. Um, it's disjointed. It's not necessarily surreal exactly, but like it is working in that kind of liminal space in the brain where it's like it's not trying to deliver rational thoughts, regular kind of coherent sentences per se. Um, Narrative, clear. It's kind of obscure. It's kind of opaque. Uh, Clark Coolidge. Ashbery has this thing where he talks about he got one of Clark Coolidge's early books. I forget which one, U.S. something, and he said it was like somebody was taking further what he had started in the Tennis Court Oath and the experiments he was doing while he lived in France. I think it's significant that like John Ashbery and Gertrude Stein both lived in Paris when they were writing this way. Maybe because of the art they were experiencing, but also I just think not being around English speaking, the English language became like detached or something to them. And they're also hearing this complete other syntax, and they're hearing this sort of like language that's foreign, and maybe they don't understand all of it, and maybe they mishear a lot of it, and think, and it creates kind of nonsense sentences or disjointed meanings or something. That's not the only. I mean, Zhukovsky was another huge, and the objectivists. Well, this was what my friend was saying, right? It's the objectivists, or she was asking, expressionists, and what was the other one? Modernists. Uh, which I think Zhukovsky probably got certain things from William Carlos Williams, at least as far as form went. But I think the thing that language poets got from objectivists was like the objectivists treated the words like objects. They really took the William Carlos Williams dictum of no ideas but in things. Especially somebody like Reznikov. It's like his poetry is so much about the thingness of like reality in his life. It's about walk, and so the words and the voice of the poet also um yeah uh become like boxes or something. I don't know. They become like, and they're also talking. I mean, Reznikov anyway is talking about objective reality, or at least like his own. Like New York, the buildings, walking around these streets. This is what I did. It's not. It isn't. At least not his side of things. Zhukovsky, I'm not as familiar with, but if you look at it, it looks like language poetry. It is more, even though the word is sort of a material, like I was saying, or an object. Like that's I think the thing that he gets from kind of Gertrude Stein, or whatever. I don't even know where. And it goes into kind of language poetry. You know, like A is a huge thing. I mean, you can tell, especially for Ron Silliman, like his whole like alphabet thing and all his kind of like book length works. You can tell how they're kind of, and maybe Bernadette Mayer and Clark Coolidge as well. But there's other strands in it. You know, the language poets, I would say one of the, I mean, especially Ron Silliman. I mean, also Bernstein is like they know like everything about poetry. Like Ron Silliman does have like an encyclopedic knowledge of shit, and so like his style is sort of a synthesis of a lot of different stuff. Um, the beats, I would say, like there are certain aspects of language poetry that might, I don't know if you'd say they were rooted in it, but like, you know, if you look at something like Old Angel Midnight and jazz in particular, jazz, improvisation, a lot of the things that were going on in music um, were important, and in painting, but like music, you know, like John Cage is one of the things that Ashbery points to. He says he had writer's block. The only time in his life he had writer's block, and it was like for a long time, I forget how long, but it may have been years. And he said he went to a John Cage recital or something on New Year's Day or something, I think. And I forget which piece it was. I think it was for prepared piano or something. And he said that's what unblocked him. And you can see the John Cage influence on Ashbery. And you can see the jazz influence on the beats. Kerouac wrote the way he did. He was imitating what people were doing with their horns and jazz and this and that. Jazz is abstract. It's improvisational. It's like a field of it's expressionist, right? And I suppose you could say that expressionist is a part of language poetry. I mean, I think you're using the language, or that's one way you could do it. Like expressionists use paint. It's more about kind of the emotion of the writer and the action of the writer as much it is about and the surface of the page and the kind of texture of all that. The sound definitely as well. It's all of that stuff. Um uh but you know, language poetry is abstract, and it is sort of like, I think, I don't know, I guess that's maybe, is that not a hard rule, I don't know. We're at, you know, if you look at, there's certain aspects of Bernadette Mayer and Clark Coolidge, like the things that I think um I mean, I suppose Clark Coolidge gets the language thing more from Ashbery. Bernadette Mayer, I'm not exactly sure what the influence would be that prompted her to write. Like Bill Berkson is another poet who kind of, well, okay, so the New York School is another part of this whole through line. I mean, the second generation. And in a certain way, language poetry, I feel like, is almost like a subset of New York School. You know, the New York School, I would say, the second generation, you know, Ashbery really did like the language poetry stuff in that one book. At least like the extreme kind of like abstract. The rest of his stuff is more kind of like, I don't know, not to generalize, but like that one book in particular is very experimental. And so he does a lot of things that like it's almost like jump cutting and discontinuity and shit like that. Um I think with the second generation of the New York School, there is all of these qualities about language as material, the surface being like a painting with color and texture and all of this. But the New York School is more rooted in kind of like this cartoonish reality, like a Frank O'Hara it's still I do this, I do that. It's still at least, well, okay, like the sonnets, for instance. Okay, Ted Berrigan, the sonnets. You could say that this book is almost like half and half. I think one of the things that really works about the sonnets is it goes. There are things that are clearly him talking to you in sort of conscious reality about, like, it's 5:15 a.m. I'm going to Brooklyn and Margie and this and that. But then there's stuff where it's like it's language poetry. It's abstract. You're not. It's almost like dream language. It's like this somnambulistic speaking in tongues or something. Language poetry is almost like speaking in tongues, really. It's like highly intelligent speaking in tongues. Um, and so, like, I'm sure there are examples of language poetry that, like, include very legible, real things. But it seems to me like what makes language poetry, like, distinctly what it is like it does kind of divorce itself from that kind of clear, in a certain way, objectivist reality. The kind of, like, Frank O'Hara, Edwin Denby, I do this, I do that, I'm in the city, I'm on fucking East 7th Street, uh, you know, the yellow hard hats, I'm eating a sandwich, Pepsi, like all of that stuff roots the New York school in New York, in objective reality, in life, in the kind of, like, show business, TV, entertainment thing of life. Language poetry feels like it's more on the tender button side of things, less on the, uh, I don't know, Alice B. Toklas side of things or something. Like, there is a name dropping aspect of New York school, and, like, a social aspect, a scene. I mean, that's not to say that. I mean, that's also language poetry. Language poetry was very much a scene, and very. I think it was more of, like, a conscientious, like, academic group. The New York school always kind of resisted being called that, and it was sort of a joke, and it seemed a little bit more casual, and, like, it certainly wasn't really codified academically the same way that, like, I mean, the language poets, a lot of them were academics, Bob Perlman, and so there was a concurrent, Barrett Watton, there was a concurrent, like, they are gaining power in academia, they're writing papers, and in a certain way, I think language poets, the theory was leading the work. It's like, it's sort of self-consciously deconstructionist. I mean, that's something I think that Ron Silliman argues, his whole book, The New Sentence. Because Ron Silliman is a committed, like, socialist and organizer. He's a leftist, and he's really lived it. So, like, his work is very political. I mean, there was a review in the New York Review of Books where Ben Lerner kind of trashed this aspect and said it was sort of privileged and irresponsible. But I do think Ron Silliman's intention, right, was, it's sort of a Rimbaud thing. Was Rimbaud the original language poet? I mean, Illuminations is language poetry, I would say. Certainly one of the key influences. The idea was, by massacring the language and the sort of the presumed, the power, the institutions of power that tell us we have to speak this way and write this way, and this is what literature is. This is what good writing is. Well, this is what, a lot of it is political. The way it reinforces the status quo. And language poetry, the idea was, by massacring the syntax, the grammar, the police of language. Gertrude Stein has something about, like, punctuation is like the police of language, and it's just kind of, it interrupts. It's traffic cops, right? It's the traffic cops of language. And for our society to work, the idea is we need that stuff. But with language poetry, the push was we're going to tear it all down by not obeying the sort of status quo corporate uh, grammar structures, sentence structures. You know, it's definitely interesting to pay attention what's in the air in American language. That is something I try to do in my poetry a lot, including, you know, shit you hear in advertising, corporate speak, legal speak, uh, slogans, taglines, you know, the choruses in music that's popular. I mean, one of the hallmarks of the New York school, I would say, at least the second generation or whatever, is like they're constantly including like song lyrics and titles. And I think that was an aspect of like they were the 60s. The New York school is really like the rock and roll or whatever of poetry. At least like, you know, the Beats were sort of like a rock and roll thing. The New York school was sort of like the 60s of what happened, you know, with the fucking Beatles and all that kind of shit. Um, I mean, I suppose it's fucking debatable that the language poets did not fucking have any effect on politics with their radical scrambling of the language. I don't know. To me, it is about a compositional style and freeing the artists. Like, this is how people should create in the, or not should, but like, to some degree, it feels more accurate to life to have just this kind of like, I mean, life is disjointed and non sequitur, and your mind is jumping around. It doesn't stay on, it's very hard actually to stay on one subject. Like, that's why we meditate, because we're trying to stay on one subject, and it's impossible. Um, but also, I think by you know, it is about touching all these different dimensions. By using the word as a surface, you're able to sort of draw with words. You're sort of able to paint with words, and by that I mean the word actually becomes like a brushstroke or like a pigment. It becomes like a red, like uh, thick kind of like icing of paint on the page. And by throwing together, you know, that's how our lives are. It's like, I mean, I don't know, at least living in New York, it is just like this music video super cut. Everything's cut real fast. Everything, you know, your mind's eye. You see something in your mind's eye. You hear something. You smell something. Somebody says something. Uh, you hear a vibration. You know, the chair inspires you to make a gestural. I think gestural, right? Like that's an expressionist thing. I guess probably a language poetry thing. Um, you know, but if you read Francois Villon, what is it, in The Thin Lion? Francois Villon reads The Thin Lion, or I forget exactly what it's called. You know, a lot of Bernard Maillar's early stuff is language poetry, and that she wrote in the 60s, in the early 60s. And Clark Coolidge and her kind of went back and forth. They were inspired by free jazz, you know. Cecil Taylor is a huge fucking influence and presence in kind of downtown New York art. Um, taking all of the licks but not necessarily playing them in that order, just letting them splurge out. Um, and so I think as artists, you're able to be more passionate. You're able to express more. You're able to be more truthful when you just say what you want to say, rather than trying to iron everything out into a linear narrative and into complete sentences. There's a place for that too. There are a lot of people who get a lot of credit for doing that. But I do think to some degree it is like a rebellious kind of counter academy to have people that are writing the language, just thrashing it, and like that's the music I like, the kind of gnarly barbed wire, like a thatch of kind of tumbleweed or thorns, or distorted guitars. Uh, it's hilarious because fucking Cornette was kind of bemoaning the. He just is an ECW hater, and he was just talking about. Well, he's not a hater, but he's like. He thought it was almost like the speech the guy gives in The Wrestler about how the '90s sucked. The '80s were so great. And then he's like, then Paul Heyman brought in kind of grunge fucking culture into wrestling with all the flannel and like the pissy attitudes, and like everybody's depressed, they want to kill themselves, Nine Inch Nails, Marilyn Manson, all in the in the Attitude Era, wrestling sort of that's the material and the stuff that's sort of like the look, the headbangers. There was this kind of in the '90s, like the guy says, and the '80s were like this big party, hair metal, Reagan, whatever, big poofy hair, makeup, hairspray, leg warmers, neon, Nintendo, Atari, Iran Contra, or what is it? And then the '90s, right? Kurt Cobain, Nirvana comes in. All of a sudden, it kills Randy the Ram's career. It kind of kills the WWF energy too. Kills. I mean, now all of a sudden Hulk Hogan, that kind of shit, it doesn't look as cool, really. And then the '90s were this kind of like flannel, Gen X, slacker, hacker. Cornette kind of bemoans. But it's interesting to see how eras change. And I think one thing language poetry does is you can always write. Like, because it doesn't have to make sense, and you can just play with words in a certain way and try to create. I mean, I think one of the magical properties and sort of spellcasting properties of poetry is you're taking words which are actually not objects, even though in a way they are, and you're combining, you're putting them, you're juxtaposing them, and just by juxtaposing these things that supposedly are not real, you can create new possibilities that exist, at least in your imagination, which in poetry world exists almost as much as reality does, or at least that's the beginning of something existing in reality. So just by virtue of the fact, I mean, words are free. It doesn't cost you anything to write poetry, really, other than like maybe the paper or talking. But like by just one of the things I used to do, or like this is something that maybe they will tell you is a writing exercise, just write anything. Just write any damn thing. And do it just to get going, just to get warmed up. The first pages you write are going to be crap or whatever, so you might as well just start writing and write anything. And so, but also, I think being in New York, and I don't know why, but like for whatever reason, probably inspired by the poetry I was reading, my real attempt as a writer and as somebody like working on my own mind over the last decade has been to sort of like defy the conventional autocompletes and try and defy sense, to write sentences that are almost like, I don't know, magnets or something, that have like both polarities within them, like containing like a contradiction within a sentence, containing like two entirely different uh and just seeing where that goes, seeing what that two entirely different ideas, notions. I might combine a thought, and as I'm writing that thought, I'll think of a vision of an image, and I'll complete it with the image, or and so part of the point is making something that, like, because a lot of times when you just write what you think, or what if you're just writing what you like, what you think is the truth, a lot of times it either sounds like facile or easily deductible, and to me, in a certain way, that's not poetry. Like, poetry, there does have to be an element of it that is like not understandable, and like, if that means that you have to like destroy your own text to make it not understandable, then so be it. I mean, a lot of E. E. Cummings shit, you're reading this and you're just like, this doesn't even make sense to him. He's making it difficult, like making it so it defies the conventions, and something that's easily readable, easily digestible, easily just making it another thing you understand and forget. It's like lifting weights or something. You have to work to understand this, and you can't understand it. It's impossible. And so a certain way, it's never able to be reduced, right? And to me, that's kind of what poetry is. It's something that you're never able to say, this is the final meaning. It's always going to inspire new interpretations. To me, like, that's what a Jackson Pollock painting does, because it's not figurative. You can't say, oh, it's about the father-son relationship and, blah, blah, blah. It's like, you don't know what the fuck. It's more like a generator for you to just kind of be inspired for your own new thoughts, and to me, that's kind of that working to but it's also just about appreciation, right? It's not only that. It's about creating beauty that also does that, right? And so, like, a Jackson Pollock painting is almost like music without lyrics, right? It's almost like classical music or something, because it is kind of just form and tone. There's emotion in it. There's content in it, you might say. Maybe even you could say that it's a story of something, I suppose. But it's also like not reducible, because it doesn't have a defined. With a Jackson Pollock, you can just appreciate the movement, the rhythm, the color. That can give you something that's beyond words in a way. That kind of like urge, or it creates this whereas like a poem that's about like how somebody died or something, it's like, oh, that moved me because like it reminded me of like blah blah blah. Whereas like language poetry, uh I would say in a certain way is almost like using words more like a melody in a way. Meaning, if it sounds good, it is good. If it looks good, it is good. You can paint a picture, which Tender Buttons throughout, she is describing things. My friend was telling me all abstraction has to be rooted in the figurative for it, and like, I don't know if I totally agree with that, but like, I also think there's some truth to it. And so like, Tender Buttons, you can tell she's talking about a carafe or whatever. It says that, right? It'll kind of say it's a fucking chair or whatever, and then it's like blind eyes, penguin, red. It's like what the fuck. If she just said, "Oh, it had four legs and it was orange," that wouldn't be as interesting. That wouldn't really be poetry, actually. And even turning it into like it's the chair that represented envy, whatever the fuck. It's like even that. I suppose in a certain way it is the ultimate privilege to just like you're not really, you're just kind of resisting having to like put your ass out there in a certain way, because what you're saying, I guess, in a certain way is just gibberish. It's not like, oh, I laid my heart bare and like it was either a good poem or not. Like it is just more like, but I don't know. It's like I wish that people could get to a place where they would appreciate that stuff more and write that way more. It's like, I know everybody feels a political responsibility to write. I mean, people write almost exclusively like confessional, coherent, guilt trips or whatever. But I would say the one part of the language poetry that really gets overlooked is the New York side of things, at least from my point of view. It seems to me like, for whatever reason, the California, New York language poets were a lot better at, like, I don't know, getting their work out there or something. But, like, to me, people like Bruce Andrews, James Sherry, who the fuck else? I mean, Michael Gottlieb was kind of associated with them a lot, or a little bit. Who else? I've been looking at this guy Michael Palmer's book. I'm not loving it that much. I think Charles Borkhouse, you might say he's a little bit of a language. Charles Alexander's got certain tendencies. I mean, once again, Charles Bernstein, of course. But to me, the New York school is still the best. And that's not even the language side of New York school. Like, to me, the best part of New York school is like the writing about real life. And the fact that it has this kind of abstract language quality to some degree is a beautiful aesthetic and style, but it's always like, I don't know, it's always just very pleasant and kind of like I said, almost just like cartoonish. It feels like the painters. Maybe it's a little, I don't know if I call it simplistic, but like maybe there's a simpleness to the word choice to some degree that like I like. Tom Raworth, I would say is he a little bit of a pre-language? Is he like an language? Like Charles North kind of feels like that to me. Like, is Charles North a language poet? To me, Charles North has more things in common with like a Schuyler, a Kenneth Koch, a Ron Padgett, a Ted Berrigan, maybe. But there's certain aspects of it that are like a little heavy on the language, I'd say. They don't, I mean, the thing is, it feels like with a lot of the West Coast language poets, it's almost like they just like dehydrated their work of everything except like their like thesis for whatever the project is supposed to be. And it does feel a little bit contrived, or like, maybe contrived is the wrong word. Whereas like New York language poetry feels a little bit more like it grew out of Ted Greenwald, right? He's sort of like a proto-language poet too. But once again, he's rooted, Chiaravalo, you could say, is sort of a language poet. But once again, they're both have this kind of cartoonish reality aspect. They talk about that, like, there is like, I don't know, an academic seriousness. The sense of humor is not as good with the West Coast language poets. Um, you know, like they're a little bit more like, I don't know. I like what they did with like their talks, right? Um, Maybe that's what I should do on Sundays. Have a talk, host a talk. I mean, these are my talks. Nobody fucking watches them. This is my language poetry rehearsal talk. So maybe I'll give a lecture. Um, you know, I find those authors more interesting. You know, the Dick Gallops, Michael Brownstein, um, poets that sort of have language poetry qualities, but it's like before the language poetry, it really does just seem like it's kind of too academic. It's like they take it a little too far that it's almost like chess or something. It's like it kind of loses the beauty of like, I mean, I think Charles Bernstein and Bruce Andrews and Ron Silliman, for the most part, Ron Silliman are able to keep it like especially Charles Bernstein. I think Charles Bernstein, even though like his shit can be corny sometimes, like I think he's able to make really exciting poems out of experiments and things. He isn't just like, okay, I'm gonna write a fucking 24 volume, you know, alphabet or whatever the fuck that book is, where it's like, Jesus Christ, like okay, I've got this book by Ron Silliman called The Age of Huts, and it's like 4 different books. And it's like one of the books I love, and the rest of them I'm kind of like, okay. I love the book Lit. I think that book is lit. But like, there's a sense of humor with New York School, and to be honest, a lot of the New York School people, you know, like Eileen Miles or Greg, right, or you know, like they didn't do language poetry. I think Eileen Miles learned certain things or like saw certain things that they were doing, and there's you know maybe a little more influenced by Ray Armantrout or something, but like Eileen Miles doesn't go totally into fucking language poetry land where it's just like pure fucking gibberish or whatever. Like Eileen Miles still mostly stays kind of personal and like first person and in their own life and they're in their own head and voice and stuff. Laura Nightiker, right, is probably maybe there's a condensing or I mean HD super influential on language poetry. I feel like I missed a whole like modernist. Of course Ezra Pound, right? And I'm sure Charles Olson. Uh I also think maybe some of that 19th century shit, like maybe Browning or like I don't know that much about that stuff, but I there's probably things about it I wouldn't be surprised if they influenced like what those guys were doing or those people. Um, Michael Gottlieb's book has kind of an interesting like uh, Romana Clef type thing about the early days of the language thing in New York. And I'm not sure who you would credit exactly for starting it, but I'm pretty sure Charles Bernstein and Bruce Andrews named it with their magazine. But I don't know if that was like in collusion or whatever with Ron Silliman on the West Coast, or if there was any how much connection was there. You know, like maybe in like a postmodern like way language poetry like is as far as you can take, I don't know, whatever mode our writing has been in for the past however many years to hundreds of years. But also like I like being able to write about life and have diary aspect and like the kind of New York School kind of amicable primary colored painting. Like a Berrigan poem does kind of remain pop or accessible. but it can also be full of a lot of things and a lot of ideas. I mean, okay, some of Ted Berrigan's later stuff, right? Like Red Shift or a lot of the later stuff. It's like it's not really language poetry per se, although maybe it goes further in that direction. You know, he's still talking about his life, but it's like he'll go deeper into like just kind of riddling but also painting with the words and stuff. Red Shift, you know, is such a memorable. It sounds like a painting or something. You can just see it, you know. But it's also like because it's kind of I don't want to say vague, but like it's not as specific as saying like bring me two donuts and a Pepsi or whatever, which is like something he maybe would have done earlier on more. It seems like later he stopped doing that kind of stuff as much. Um, Aram Saroyan, is that language poetry? The Light poem? I suppose it is. Somebody was saying that Aram Saroyan, they asked Ted Berrigan who the most influential poet on him was, or something like that. He said Aram Saroyan. Kind of interesting. You know, I would say I don't know that Alice Notley really goes in that direction very much. Once again, like I was saying, with a lot of the New York writers, it seems like they didn't really go that way. Some of them did, right? The Charles Bernstein or the, right? But that, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that was necessarily like some kind of, I'm sure it wasn't a choice for anybody, but, uh, you know, when it becomes a movement like that, it seems like people get like caught up in their own manifestos or whatever. And it's like, okay, now I got to write all these books to like fulfill like my ideas about what this is. And it's like, it's kind of nice. I think it's nice that the New York School points to reality because I think that does like tell people something about what they can do with their own life. Like in a certain way, there is something like exclusionary or elitist about language poetry in that like your average person would pick it up and probably be like offended. You know, like a fucking I could write this fucking this is what the fuck is this? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe they wouldn't have that reaction. Um, Whereas like a Frank O'Hara poem, I don't know. They can use that in Mad Men or whatever, and like people are gonna like be touched by it. Uh, like maybe there is like a cerebral intellectual quality. Like is language poetry like missing an emotional or like I don't know, like it's definitely like sensual, I would say, but it's not like is it moving? I don't know. Maybe in a deeper way. In a certain way, I think it is about like working on people on a deeper level than just like, hey, I'm gonna read you some poem that's like gonna knock you on your ass. Like I think you're actually trying to work on them in a deeper level. At least I hope I am. like like I was saying, like with an abstract expressionist painting, or part of what I get from language poetry is that anybody can write this way. You can write this way. I think that's, you know, that's how I feel about noise music. You know, part of the reason why I started doing noise music, if you want to call it that, is like because I played with people that weren't necessarily like virtuosos, but you were still able to create beautiful music. I think that is the truth. I think we're fed a lot of bullshit about like technique, right? And poetry especially is meant to be just like, you just say it. Just say whatever the fuck you want to say it how you want to say it. And if it's emotional or whatever or deep, that's good. And I think it's more important that people make music and make poetry and share it with each other and form. It's not a bad place to like form communicate, actually. You know, like I think you can communicate things to other people. Maybe like you can definitely communicate to more people if you like get up and do it in front of somebody or send it out or uh, you know uh, like with my own shit, it's like that's kind of what I'm trying to show people is like anybody can do this. But also like when you're doing it, like I think about the internal rhymes, the repeating consonants and vowels, the repeating sounds, you know, the way it looks on the page, the mental image it's giving you, the image. You know, I'm trying to write down things that I see in my mind's eye. I'm trying to write down things I literally see. I'm trying to write down, like I said, things I smell, things I hear people say, telepathic messages, things that just pop into your head, fully formed, things I hear on fucking podcasts. You know, you try to experiment. You know, I try to write down little funny things that happen that I feel like are narratively significant. Um, but attaching my poem to life and bringing my life into it so much is a way of like, well, first of all, just making it making every step of the life have meaning and like be artistic or ritualistic or ideally both. And also like an action against the murder of the planet, an ethical choice is all by paying attention to all this shit, by writing it down, by being a steward of the language, by thinking about how people actually speak, by actually being out in the streets with a bunch of fucking, you know, poets that like are just like me, and then seeing the really good not to say they aren't really good, but seeing the academic or whatever, the more established people, you know, just cultivating your instrument as much as you can, listening to the best music, seeing the best art, reading the best shit, listening, you know, doing stuff that makes you happy, makes you laugh, being as smart as you can be, actually taking action with your, if you have an idea for a project, for a movie, or like my zines, right? Actually printing it out, actually giving it to people, actually hosting an open mic, actually posting videos, like doing things in real life with your work, and just doing it, not worrying about if you're ready or not. You're ready, just do it, just get out there. I think sharing it and communicating, right? I mean, I don't do, I suppose, the best I could do, but like with my books and with what I choose to read, like I'm trying to send people messages. I'm trying, you know, if there's something that I think I need to say. My poems are basically everything that I just want to say to people publicly. They're the things I want to remember, and they're, if I'm able to make like word art out of it that I feel like is complete and fully formed, I'll write it down. If I have a little sentence that I feel like, okay, this is a little musical phrase or thought noodle or whatever that like I feel like is a little art piece, boom, it's going down. And well, this is, maybe I'll end on this, is like I do want to talk about like the word as object, because this is kind of the theme of the whole thing. And like as writers or as mental employees or thought workers, you're taught sticks and stones can break your bones, but words will never hurt you. Meaning a word is not tangible, and so what is it worth? What do you get paid for it? What do you get paid for like your writing? What do you get paid to write articles? You know, what do you get paid to speak? And like they are real. They are objects. They are it's no different. I feel like being a poet, and no disrespect or anything to like jewelers, to me it's exactly the same thing. In fact, maybe it's a little more specific in a way because every word and every thought is different. And you're always trying to come up with new stuff, new. To me, all the letters are like pigments. They look a certain way on the page. Combining them in different ways and new ways is exciting. It's once again, it's like a chemistry kit. It's like a train set. It's like a create a wrestler. On the WWF games, the best thing they ever had, the best video games were always creative. Mario Paint, one of the greatest video games ever made, and the WWF games were pioneering because they had to create a wrestler feature, which I have to give mad props to whoever allowed that to happen at WWE because like that changed. That was like inviting kids to use their imagination, and it opened up a whole world because now you can create the moves, create the taunts, create the outfit, the costume, the gimmick. Like you're in the game. That's how Frankly Fabulous, I made Frankly Fabulous in the video games. And like inviting the kid to make creative choices rather than just like you followed this quest and then you have to beat the game. To me, that's what I'm trying to do with my poetry. And with all my work is like it's just like a tool set for you. You say, oh, he did this. He carried a notebook around and he wrote shit down. And he wrote shit down that people said, or he filmed, shit, or he edited it together. He did events. He went to events. He talked to, whatever the fuck it is. The conversation can be an art form. The happening. It's all a happening. And it's all happening. And, yeah, I don't know. I would say, the language poets. Erica Hunt is definitely somebody worth mentioning because there are aspects of Hunt's work that are like language poetry, but it is also rooted. I know that she has spent time in San Francisco and she's a native New Yorker, and you can kind of see that in the style. Um, like there are definite language poetry things aesthetically, but it is once again it's still rooted in a personal experience, sort of subjective experience, and also I mean obviously just like her identity, right? Um, which is different than most of the language poetry people, I would say. Um, she's not a white guy. Uh, but I would still say that my favorites are like a lot of Ron Padgett's early stuff. There's a lot of his poems in Great Balls of Fire and stuff that are like language poetry. They're like transcriptions of languages he doesn't understand, where he just kind of writes this. I prefer that stuff actually. I love Ron Padgett stuff, but like he's gotten into this groove where he just writes these kind of like very simple like wisdom poems or something, and they're great. But like I liked his stuff that was like more like language poetry and kind of zany. He got that I think from Ashbery and all that stuff I mentioned earlier, but also from the surrealists in Paris. He spent time in Paris, and I know he was very, the New York school I think did pattern itself in certain ways on those Paris kind of surrealists of the fucking early 20th century. Apollinaire, Frank O'Hara was kind of the Apollinaire of New York. But I'm sure that's another aspect of language poetry. Although I'm not exactly sure how it would connect, but those surrealists and stuff, Dot Da, Cut Ups, Tristan Zara, a lot of that shit sounds like language poetry. And is it postmodern? Is that postmodern? I'm not exactly sure where modernism ends and postmodernism begins, but language poetry was like the last major academic movement thing that happened before like the conceptual poetry and flarf and all that shit, where it just got kind of like it just became like the art world where it was like way more about the idea and copying and pasting shit and less about, I mean, at least with language poetry it was actually writing. I like language poetry. To me it's like free jazz. It's like listening to fucking Sun Ra or whatever, noise music. It's like noise music, which is so weird because all of the fucking music that I see cool people listening to is noise music. And yet I don't see that much language poetry. I see sincere personal narratives and shit like that. So, uh, it's definitely recommended to look into. I've got a lot of it. I like a lot of it. In a certain way, I mean, I love the New York School. It's always going to be my favorite thing. But like, I don't know. Some of the language poetry, I think, like to be honest, I don't know. I know it's lame to say, but I think some of the Ron Silliman shit is like maybe like the best poetry anybody wrote in like after, I don't even know, 1975 or something. Or at least I don't know, from that generation, let's say. There's some of the Charles Bernstein shit, and obviously some of the Eileen Myles shit is pretty incandescent. But there's a few parts of Ron Silliman that I've seen that I'm like, this is hot fire. uh, I don't know that I've been as excited by any of the rest of it. But is there anything else I need to mention about language poetry? I'm sure there's a lot more that plays into it, but Ted Greenwald, once again, sort of a proto language. That's like the reading list, I would say. Uh, Steve Benson. Well, okay, grand piano. I should mention grand piano because grand piano, um, Kit Robinson. Oh yeah, I've got the Messianic Trees. Some of those Columbia guys were looking at that the other day. Steve Carey is not really language poetry, but like he's like language poetry, but like he's like actually writing really really beautiful poetry. And once again, he stays kind of in his personal narrative voice or something in a way that's like actually, I think, stronger. Um, but yeah, okay, Grand Piano is really an amazing project that the language poetry, once again, it was very self-conscious how they're banded together in this like group, which is cool. Like, I guess that's like what the situation is for or whatever. But they wrote these books where it's like, I think there's 12 of them. And so they had this reading series at this place called the Grand Piano in San Francisco. First of all, they got to live in San Francisco. Like, how fucking awesome. Like, they probably had amazing lives. I'm jealous. But, so they had this reading series at the Grand Piano. I guess there was a Grand Piano downstairs. And the idea being that, like, so that with this book series, I think, is there 12 of them? There's 12 books. And so, like, every book, they all write, like, a piece that's, like, sort of a personal narrative or whatever. I mean, they're poets. They can do whatever they want. But it's meant to be sort of like a memoir-ish retelling of, like, the language poetry thing. But I guess specifically the Grand Piano reading series, but, like, it's really just kind of like an oral history, more or less. Except they do it in this kind of, like, poetic form where it's like there's a grid, and this writer writes the first piece, and then all the other writers like have to follow it or whatever. I don't know. I don't remember exactly what the form is, but it's like it's different than a lot of the language poetry stuff because it is just them talking in their own voices about the way it went down and telling stories and this and that. And a lot of what they did, I do feel like was really interesting. And like these talks and stuff, I don't know that there was similar things going on in New York. You know, a lot of the readings and shit you hear about that were going on in San Francisco in the 70s and 80s sounded pretty exciting. Not that they weren't doing shit like that in New York, but I can't think of a comparable thing in New York where all the poets did like talks. Maybe I should host talks here. I think that's what I should do. At least it wasn't codified in quite the same way or organized in the same way or recorded for posterity in the same way. But I do recommend the Grand Piano. It's really, I love reading poets' memoirs and poet biographies and like the lives of the poets. And it's the lives of the poets completely. You know, it's like, here's the language poets kind of trading stories and talking about whatever they want to talk about, you know, politics of the era, history, this, that, San Francisco. So it's a fun thing. It's in 12 different books. So you kind of have to find them all. I've got like 3 of them. I haven't read it in a while because I'm trying not to romanticize the San Francisco thing too much. If I read it too much, I'd be like, fuck, I gotta move to San Francisco. But what I would like to do, I'd like to do a comparable thing for New York. I feel like the New York school needs a comparable series where it's like everybody kind of gets to tell their story or whatever. So anyway, thank you for watching. But as like a group, you know, kind of in this intermingled group thing. I don't know. That was the poetry lecture. We'll see you. We're back on next Monday. And I want to do talks. Maybe we'll do a talk on Sunday. Thank you for watching. Peace out.